On the last day of 2006, December 31st, Britain sent $83 million to America. This wasn't just any payment. It was the last installment of a debt that started way back in 1946. Think about this. Britain had just finished paying for World War II 61 years after they won. 3 entire generations of British people paid taxes to America just for the right to survive Hitler's Germany. But here's the shocking truth they never tell you in history class. Britain wasn't paying America for winning the war. They were paying for permission to keep fighting. And those interest payments? That was just the tip of the iceberg. From 1940 to 1945, America pulled off the biggest peaceful money grab in human history. When World War II started, Britain was the richest creditor nation on the planet. They controlled 1/4 of all land on Earth through their massive empire. When the war ended, Britain was completely broke, their gold was gone, their investments were sold off, their military bases were leased away for almost a century, and they owed America $31 billion. That's nearly $500 billion in today's money. But losing money wasn't even the worst part. The real loss was their entire empire. This wasn't friends helping friends. This wasn't charity between allies. This was the most brilliant wealth transfer in history, dressed up as help. And America's Treasury Department executed it with surgical precision while Britain was literally fighting to survive against Nazi Germany. Let me break down exactly how Lend-Lease really worked. What Britain was forced to give up. Who made fortunes from Britain's desperation. Why America pulled the plug just 1 week after Japan surrendered. And how the 1946 loan crushed whatever economic power Britain had left. This isn't just about World War II trivia. This is about understanding how America builds and keeps its empire. Not through military invasion, but through debt, forced sales, and taking wealth from allies when they're at their weakest. The same strategy America used on Britain in 1941? It's still being used on American allies today. Let me show you exactly how America stripped Britain of everything while calling it friendship. December 8, 1940, Winston Churchill wrote the most critical letter of his entire political life. He addressed it to Franklin Roosevelt, and it started by explaining Britain's desperate military situation. German submarines were destroying British ships in the Atlantic Ocean. German bombers were attacking British cities every night. Britain's army needed everything: equipment, bullets, planes, tanks, you name it. Then Churchill admitted something devastating. Britain was completely broke. Not just low on cash, not having financial trouble, totally and completely bankrupt. The British Treasury had zero money left to buy American supplies. In just 7 months of war, Britain had spent every penny. History books teach this letter as a desperate cry for help between friends. They say this was Churchill begging for help against Hitler. But if you actually read the letter carefully, you'll see something different. Churchill wasn't begging for help. He was negotiating how to sell off Britain piece by piece. Before September 1939, when the war started, Britain was the wealthiest country in the entire world. The British Empire covered 35.5 million square kilometers. That's 24% of all land on planet Earth. British people own $22 billion worth of investments overseas. That equals $450 billion in today's money. British companies owned railways in Argentina, copper mines in Chile, rubber farms in Malaysia, and oil fields in Persia. London was the financial capital of the world. The British pound was what everyone used for international trade. Britain had $6 billion in gold sitting in vaults. Only America had more gold than that. In 7 months of fighting, all of it vanished. How did that happen? Because America demanded it. When Britain declared war in September 1939, America stayed officially neutral. Most Americans wanted nothing to do with European wars. Congress had passed laws called the Neutrality Act specifically to keep America out. But these laws had one clause that would financially destroy Britain: cash and carry. The law said countries at war could buy American weapons and supplies, but they had to pay cash up front and ship everything on their own boats. No loans, no credit. Cold hard gold before anything left American docks. Britain had no other option. The empire desperately needed American steel, oil, planes, and weapons. The factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh were the only places making enough war supplies. So Britain paid. In June 1940, Britain launched Operation Fish. They loaded every ounce of their gold reserves onto warships and passenger ships and sent them across the dangerous Atlantic Ocean where German submarines hunted. The destination was vaults in Canada and America. It was the largest physical movement of wealth ever recorded in history. $7 billion in gold bars and financial securities. Britain's entire national treasure shipped away to foreign countries just to pay American bills. By November 1940, the gold was completely gone. Britain was still placing orders, signing contracts for planes and tanks. But the Treasury back in London told the British buyers in Washington there were literally no dollars left to pay. Britain was 7 months into a war that would last 6 years. The money had already disappeared. This is where the myth of Lend-Lease starts. According to the story, Roosevelt wanted to help Britain, but American voters opposed it. So he invented Lend-Lease, a program where America would loan equipment to Britain and Britain would give it back after the war ended. Roosevelt explained it with a simple story. If your neighbor's house catches fire, you don't make him pay for your garden hose. You loan him the hose and he returns it when the fire's out. It was a beautiful, heartwarming story. It was also a complete lie. The real Lend-Lease was negotiated in secret meetings between the U.S. Treasury and desperate British officials. The American running those negotiations was Henry Morgenthau Jr., the Treasury Secretary and Roosevelt's best friend. Morgenthau had zero interest in garden hoses. He was interested in taking every asset Britain owned before giving them $1 of help. In December 1940, before Congress even voted on Lend-Lease, Morgenthau demanded a complete accounting of the entire British Empire. He wanted a list of every single asset owned by the British government and every asset owned by private British citizens anywhere on Earth. Let that sink in for a moment. Britain was fighting for its life against Nazi Germany. London was being bombed every single night. And America's condition for help was that Britain reveal all its financial secrets to a foreign government and prove they were absolutely broke. The British negotiators, led by Sir Frederick Phillips, couldn't believe it. Phillips argued that Britain had already sold all its gold. He explained that forcing Britain to sell long-term investments during wartime would be a disaster. Britain would get pennies on the dollar. He warned that stripping Britain of its overseas income would leave the country broke after the war. Morgenthau didn't care. His position was crystal clear. If Britain still owns assets in America, why should American taxpayers pay for the war? Sell everything first. Then we'll discuss aid. Congress debated Lend-Lease throughout January and February 1941. Anti-war congressmen argued that Britain was secretly rich and trying to trick America into paying their bills. Morgenthau needed proof that Britain was truly bankrupt. He needed a sacrifice. He found it in American Viscose Corporation. American Viscose was the biggest manufacturer of rayon and fake silk in America. A British company called Courtaulds owned it. American Viscose was worth over $100 million. It generated $10 million every year in profits that went back to London. Morgenthau told the British negotiators to sell American Viscose immediately and put all the money in the U.S. Treasury to pay for weapons they'd already ordered. The British fought back. Selling American Viscose during a war under pressure would be financial suicide. But Morgenthau gave them an ultimatum: sell American Viscose or Lend-Lease dies in Congress. On March 15, 1941, the British government seized American Viscose Corporation from its owners, using emergency war powers. It was a forced purchase, no negotiation allowed. The sale was handled by American investment bankers who knew Britain had to sell. They showed no mercy. American Viscose sold for $54.4 million. That was half its real value. The British government paid Courtaulds with British pounds in London, adding more debt. The dollars from the sale went straight to the U.S. Treasury. This wasn't friends helping friends. This was a foreclosure. America was liquidating British assets at bargain basement prices while Britain was fighting Hitler. But American Viscose was just the start. Morgenthau forced Britain to sell $650 million in U.S. stocks and securities owned by British citizens. British owned shares in American companies across every industry. investment portfolios that took 100 years to build. By mid-1941, Britain had liquidated $1.1 billion in American investments. That's $22 billion in today's money. The U.S. Treasury tracked every single sale, verified all the money, and only after the liquidation was finished did Lend-Lease money start flowing. But the humiliation went beyond just selling financial assets. In September 1940, before Lend-Lease was even proposed, Britain negotiated something called the Destroyers for Bases deal. Britain desperately needed destroyers to fight German submarines in the Atlantic Ocean. Roosevelt agreed to give Britain 50 old World War I destroyers sitting in storage. These were outdated, rusty, barely functional ships that the U.S. Navy didn't even want. In exchange, Britain gave America 99-year leases on military bases in Newfoundland, Canada, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Trinidad, Antigua, and British Guiana. Think about this exchange for a second. Britain gave America military control over the entire Western Hemisphere, the Caribbean, and the North Atlantic for almost a century in exchange for 50 worthless old ships. These bases let America project military power across the entire Atlantic Ocean. They became the foundation of American control over the hemisphere. And Britain gave them away for ships that barely worked. It was like pawning your family's mansion to buy groceries. The Lend-Lease Act passed Congress on March 11, 1941. It authorized $7 billion at first, eventually growing to $50 billion for all Allied countries. For Britain specifically, $31 billion in aid over 4 years. The propaganda called it the arsenal of democracy. Roosevelt said America would be the great supplier of weapons to defeat tyranny. And yes, Lend-Lease did keep Britain in the war. Without American supplies, Britain would have been starved into surrender. But Lend-Lease was never a gift. It was a lease. The name itself tells you the truth. Britain was renting American equipment with the understanding that there would be payback later. And buried deep in the Lend-Lease agreement was Article 7, a clause that would destroy the British Empire. Article 7 required that in exchange for aid, Britain must agree to eliminate discriminatory treatment in international trade after the war ended. That sounds harmless, right? Free trade, open markets. But discriminatory treatment was code language for imperial preference. Imperial preference was the economic wall that kept the British Empire together. It was a tariff system where British products were cheaper in empire markets than foreign products. Canada, Australia, India, and South Africa all bought British goods because British goods had preferential tax rates. This system protected British factories from American competition. American cars were superior. American machinery was more efficient. But in empire markets, British goods were cheaper because of the tariff protections. Article 7 required Britain to tear down imperial preference after the war ended. Britain had to destroy its own economic walls and let American companies compete freely in empire markets. The British negotiators completely understood what this meant. It was the death sentence for the empire as an economic system. The German bombers were flying overhead. German submarines were in the Atlantic. Britain signed. Britain fought World War II with American equipment, paid for by selling off its empire and promising to dismantle whatever was left. As the war continued through 1942, 1943, and 1944, the wealth transfer sped up. American industry exploded. U.S. GDP grew by 75% during the war years. American factories produced weapons for the war and also consumer products for global markets. Meanwhile, Britain converted every single factory to war production. Britain stopped selling goods overseas. British companies abandoned markets in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And who stepped in to fill those markets? American companies? While British factories made Spitfire fighter planes, American factories made Spitfires and also refrigerators, radios, cars, and tractors for the entire world. The United States was fighting the war while simultaneously stealing Britain's commercial future. By 1944, the transfer was finished. Global gold reserves had moved from London to Fort Knox. The financial center of power had permanently shifted across the Atlantic Ocean, but Britain believed the sacrifice would be honored. British officials believed that because Britain fought alone for 2 years, because Britain bankrupted itself to defeat Hitler, America would be generous after the war. They were completely wrong. August 15, 1945. Japan surrendered. World War II was over. In London, crowds celebrated outside Buckingham Palace. The war was won. 7 days later, August 21, 1945, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9620. Lend-Lease was terminated. Immediately. Completely. American supply ships in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean were ordered to turn around and sail back to America. No adjustment period, no grace period. The lifeline was cut off. The British government was shocked into paralysis. They assumed aid would continue during rebuilding. The British economy had been completely twisted for war production. Factories needed to be converted back to making civilian products. That takes time. Britain was importing half its food and nearly all its raw materials, paid for with Lend-Lease dollars. Without those dollars, Britain faced mass starvation. John Maynard Keynes, the most brilliant economist of that century, calculated that Britain faced a financial disaster. Within months, Britain would have to stop paying bills, stop importing food, and ration food down to starvation levels. There was only one choice. Britain had to beg for a loan. In September 1945, a dying John Maynard Keynes traveled to Washington. He was 62 years old, suffering from heart disease that would kill him within months. He was traveling to America not as an expert, but as a beggar. Keynes believed he had a moral argument. Britain fought alone for 2 years while America stayed neutral. Britain sacrificed its entire economy for Western civilization. Therefore, America should give Britain a grant of $6 billion, not a loan. A gift, payment for the sacrifice. Keynes called it justice. But when Keynes arrived in Washington, he discovered that justice wasn't something Americans were interested in. The American negotiators, led by Fred Vinson, were unmoved by Keynes's moral arguments. The war was over. The American public was tired of paying for Europe. Congress was suspicious of Britain's new Labour government, which had been elected promising to nationalize industries. The Americans offered a loan, not a grant, a loan of $3.75 billion at 2% interest. It was barely enough to survive. And it came with conditions designed to destroy what remained of British economic independence. The most devastating condition was sterling convertibility. The Americans demanded that within 1 year of getting the loan, Britain must make the pound fully convertible. This meant anyone holding British pounds could walk into a bank and exchange them for US dollars. The Americans framed this as free trade. But it was a trap. During the war, Britain had forced its colonies to accept payment in pounds, but forbidden them from converting pounds to dollars. This created a closed system. Countries like India, Australia, and Egypt had pounds but could only spend them on British goods. This system protected British industry, but the Americans wanted it destroyed. They knew that if the pound became convertible, everyone holding pounds would immediately sell them to buy dollars. Because American goods were better and everyone wanted American products. Keynes knew this condition would destroy Britain. He fought against it until his health collapsed. But the alternative was starvation. Britain had no choice. The Anglo-American Loan Agreement was signed in July 1946. Keynes died in April 1946. His heart gave out under the stress of trying to save his country from its closest ally. The winter of 1947 was the coldest winter in British history. Blizzards buried the entire country. Coal froze solid. Power stations shut down. People shivered in homes with no heat. And in the middle of this frozen misery, the clock ran out on the American condition. On July 15, 1947, Britain made the pound sterling convertible as required by the loan agreement. The result was a financial massacre. The moment the window opened, the world rushed to dump pounds. Countries holding sterling for years unloaded it to buy dollars. In one single month, Britain lost hundreds of millions of dollars from the loan. The bleeding was so bad that after just 5 weeks, on August 20, 1947, Britain was forced to suspend convertibility. Britain had burned through 1/4 of the entire loan in 5 weeks for absolutely nothing. The humiliation was total. This financial collapse had immediate consequences for world power. In February 1947, Britain sent a telegram to the U.S. State Department. For 100 years, Britain had protected Greece and Turkey, keeping Soviet influence out of the Mediterranean. The telegram said, "We can't afford it anymore. We're leaving. If you want to stop the communists, you'll have to do it yourselves." This triggered the Truman Doctrine. The United States stepped in to fill the gap. It was the formal admission that Britain was no longer a superpower. In 1949, with the economy still struggling, Britain devalued the pound from $4.03 to $2.80. Overnight, British people became 30% poorer compared to the rest of the world. But the final humiliation was the debt itself. The Anglo-American loan of 1946 was never forgiven. It was a commercial debt with 2% annual interest payments. Every single year for 6 decades, the British Treasury wrote a check to the United States Treasury. Through the economic boom of the 1950s, the inflation crisis of the 1970s, the Thatcher privatizations, the Blair years, the payments continued. The final payment was made on December 29, 2006, 61 years after victory. So who profited from this extraction? Let me show you the names. Henry Morgenthau Jr., Treasury Secretary, orchestrated the entire liquidation. After the war, Morgenthau remained wealthy and influential. He never faced any consequences for stripping an ally during its darkest hour. The American banks that handled the forced sale of British assets made millions in fees. J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, they all facilitated the liquidation and profited from the desperation. American corporations that bought British assets at fire sale prices made fortunes. American Viscose, bought for $54 million, was actually worth over $100 million. The buyers doubled their investment instantly. The military-industrial companies that supplied Lend-Lease equipment, Boeing, Lockheed, Ford, General Motors, they were all paid by the U.S. government, which then billed Britain. These companies made billions from the war while Britain went bankrupt buying their products. And the United States government itself benefited most of all. By 1945, America held 2/3 of all the world's gold reserves. The dollar replaced the pound as the global reserve currency. American military bases circled the entire globe. The U.S. achieved global dominance not through military conquest, but through debt. The British Empire wasn't conquered by force. It was purchased. The United States acquired the assets, the military bases, the markets, and the global influence through a distressed asset sale managed by the U.S. Treasury. This wasn't unique to Britain. The exact same playbook has been used on every American ally since 1945. After World War II, Germany was rebuilt through the Marshall Plan, but Marshall Plan aid came with strings attached. Germany had to open its markets to American products, host American military bases, and align its foreign policy with Washington. By the 1950s, Germany was prosperous but completely dependent. Japan after 1945 was occupied and restructured. The Japanese economy was rebuilt with American aid, but Japan became a protectorate. U.S. military bases in Japan remain to this day. Japan holds over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds. Japan cannot pursue independent foreign policy without American approval. South Korea after the Korean War, U.S. military presence, U.S. economic influence everywhere. South Korea is wealthy today, but strategically dependent on American military protection. The pattern repeats over and over. Crisis creates dependency. Dependency requires giving up control. Giving up control transfers wealth and power to the United States. Britain in 1940 wasn't conquered by Germany. It was conquered by the United States using debt, forced liquidations, and contract clauses disguised as friendship. The mythology of World War II teaches that America saved Britain from Hitler. The reality is that America bought Britain at a discount price. And Britain is still paying for it. Understanding this isn't about hating America or rewriting history. It's about seeing how power actually operates in the real world. Empires aren't built through obvious military conquest anymore. They're built through finance, debt, and crisis management. When your ally is desperate, when the bombs are falling, when people are starving, that's when you extract what you want. That's when you force the fire sale. That's when you rewrite all the terms in your favor. The special relationship between the U.S. and UK is celebrated as an alliance of equals. But read the actual documents. Look at the real numbers. Britain gave up everything, America took everything. In December 1940, Churchill wrote to Roosevelt begging for help. In doing so, he signed away the empire. He traded the entire British Empire for survival. It was a deal that had to be made. There was no alternative. But the cost was Britain's future. Britain defeated Hitler but lost the empire. Britain won the war but was bankrupted by its closest ally. And 3 generations of British taxpayers paid America for the privilege of not dying. The Lend-Lease agreement wasn't the arsenal of democracy. It was the greatest wealth extraction in human history, executed with legal precision while Britain was fighting for its very survival. If this showed you how international alliances really work behind the scenes, hit that subscribe button. Because the same playbook used on Britain in 1941 is being used right now on other countries. The dollar as the reserve currency, the debt trap of U.S. Treasury bonds, the military bases that create dependency. It's all the same mechanism working today.